David Berkowitz, later known as the infamous Son of Sam, entered the world on June 1, 1953, in Brooklyn, New York, under the name Richard David Falco. His biological mother, Elizabeth Betty Broder, came from a troubled background. At the time of his birth, she was unmarried and struggling. His biological father, Joseph Kleinman, was a married man who refused to leave his wife and family. To avoid scandal and hardship, Elizabeth gave her infant son up for adoption only a few days after his birth. That decision would set in motion a life path filled with abandonment, anger, and ultimately violence. The child was adopted by Nathan and Pearl Berkowitz, a working-class Jewish couple who lived in the Bronx. They were loving, but reserved, and much older than most parents raising a newborn. Pearl was especially devoted, but she also struggled with her own health issues, which created a home that was stable yet emotionally restrained. The Berkowitz family gave Richard a new name, David Berkowitz. For most of his childhood, David believed his adoptive parents were his true biological family. The truth of his adoption and the painful rejection by his birth parents would not come until later, but its shadow was present throughout his formative years. As a young boy, David was described as bright but deeply troubled. Teachers and neighbors noticed he was restless, prone to sudden outbursts, and unable to connect with other children. His adoptive parents tried their best to give him comfort, but David always carried a sense of being unwanted. He often felt different, excluded, and misunderstood. This sense of disconnection would grow stronger as he entered school. By the time he was a teenager, David had developed a fascination with fire. He became what psychologists later described as a compulsive arsonist. He would set small fires around his neighborhood, watching them burn with an intensity that disturbed those who knew him. In later years, investigators linked him to hundreds of unsolved arsons in New York City, long before the infamous shootings that earned him his deadly nickname. Fire gave him a sense of power and control, something missing from his otherwise lonely and confused childhood. Another troubling sign emerged. David was cruel to animals. Neighbors recalled instances of him harassing pets and showing little empathy for suffering. Combined with his fire setting, this behavior was a clear red flag for deeper psychological issues. Yet in the 1950s and 1960s, mental health awareness was limited. Many dismissed his actions as boys being boys, not recognizing them as early warning signs of a potential future predator. The most defining event of his childhood, however, came with the death of his adoptive mother, Pearl. When David was just a teenager, Pearl died of cancer. The loss shattered him. She had been his anchor, the one person he felt truly cared for him. Without her, David spiraled further into isolation. His relationship with his adoptive father, Nathan, was strained. Nathan eventually remarried and moved on, but David could not. He grew angrier, more detached, and increasingly resentful of the world around him. School was another battlefield for young David. He struggled academically, not because he lacked intelligence, but because his mind wandered constantly. He was easily distracted, and his peers often bullied him for being awkward and different. These experiences deepened his feelings of alienation. He often imagined violent scenarios where he could get revenge against those who mocked him. While these fantasies remained in his mind during childhood, they foreshadowed the violence he would unleash as an adult. As he grew older, David began to wrestle with questions about his identity. In his late teens, he discovered he had been adopted. This revelation crushed him. He became obsessed with his biological mother, whom he eventually tracked down as an adult. When he learned the details of his birth, that he was the unwanted product of an affair, that his father had abandoned him and that his mother had given him away, he felt betrayed all over again. To David, this confirmed what he had always feared, that he was unwanted, unloved, and discarded. This discovery ignited a deep rage within him. Instead of seeking healing, he internalized his pain and turned it into resentment toward society as a whole. He began to believe he was destined for something dark, that he was cursed from birth. These feelings became the fuel for the violence he would later commit. During his adolescence, David also showed signs of paranoia and delusional thinking. Friends and acquaintances described him as withdrawn and sometimes strangely obsessed with religious and supernatural topics. He spoke of demons, evil forces, and destiny in ways that unsettled those around him. While most dismissed this as eccentricity, it was an early glimpse into the disturbed mind that would later claim to be controlled by a demonic dog commanding him to kill. By the end of his teenage years, David was a young man adrift. He had no clear goals, no stable family support, and no healthy coping mechanisms for his anger and confusion. He was restless, angry, and searching for belonging. This search led him to make a drastic decision. He enlisted in the military. The structure of the army, he believed, would give him purpose and discipline. For a time, it seemed like a fresh start. But the scars of his childhood, the rejection, the isolation, the obsession with fire and violence, were never far from the surface. The boy who once set fires in the Bronx was about to step into adulthood, carrying with him the seeds of destruction that would one day terrify New York City. The stage was set for the emergence of the son of Sam. As David Berkowitz moved from his turbulent childhood into adolescence, the shadows of his early years followed him closely. The trauma of losing his adoptive mother, the rejection he felt upon discovering the truth about his adoption, and his growing sense of isolation carved deep scars into his developing identity. For many young men, adolescence is a time of discovery and social growth, but for David it was instead a period marked by alienation, suppressed anger, and a troubling fascination with destruction. By the late 1960s, the Bronx was a tough environment for any teenager. Crime rates were rising, but drugs were spreading, and street violence was becoming part of daily life. David, however, was not drawn to the typical outlets of delinquent youth, gangs or drugs. His rebellion took on a darker, more solitary form. He continued to set fires in vacant lots and abandoned buildings, a habit that gave him a secret thrill. He felt powerful in these moments, watching flames devour structures, knowing he had caused the chaos yet remained unseen. Fire setting was not just an act of destruction, it was his way of exerting control over a world that made him feel powerless. His adoptive father, Nathan Berkowitz, noticed his son's troubling behavior, but did not fully grasp its depth. Nathan's remarriage after Pearl's death only drove a deeper wedge between father and son. David saw his stepmother as a replacement he could never accept. The home environment became colder and more distant. With no emotional anchor, David retreated further into his own mind. He was a loner at school, avoided by classmates who found him odd, and bullied by those who saw weakness in his awkward demeanor. Despite his social struggles, David was not unintelligent. He had an average IQ and could hold conversations when he chose to, but his mind was constantly restless, drifting into fantasies of violence and revenge. Teachers described him as distracted and prone to daydreaming. Few realized that his daydreams often revolved around fire, destruction, and domination. By the age of 18, David faced a crossroads. He had little interest in college, and his strained home life offered no stability. Restless and searching for direction, he made a life-altering decision. He enlisted in the United States Army in 1971. For a boy who had grown up feeling powerless, the Army represented order, discipline, and the chance to prove himself. He hoped it would give him the structure he lacked and perhaps erase the feelings of inadequacy that haunted him. Military service began as a turning point. Stationed at Fort Knox, Kentucky, and later serving in South Korea, David appeared to adapt better than expected. The Army gave him clear rules, routines, and responsibilities, which momentarily channeled his restless energy. He was trained in weaponry, marksmanship, and tactics, skills that he would later use with deadly precision. Ironically, the very training meant to shape him into a soldier of discipline became the foundation for his future role as a calculated killer. David's time in the Army was not without incident. While he followed orders, he was never fully comfortable in the social structure of military life. Fellow soldiers described him as strange, withdrawn, and moody. He had few friends and often kept to himself. Though he did not cause major trouble, he also did not stand out as someone who was thriving. Underneath the surface, the same psychological cracks were present. The Army may have masked his inner turmoil, but it did not cure it. During his service, David also traveled to South Korea, where he reportedly visited sex workers and became more exposed to adult relationships. Yet these encounters were transactional and failed to ease his loneliness. He longed for meaningful connection but lacked the emotional capacity to form it. His interactions with women were awkward, often filled with frustration and rejection. The seeds of resentment toward women, already planted during his teenage years of bullying and rejection, began to grow stronger during this period. After 3 years of service, David received an honorable discharge from the Army in 1974. He returned to New York, but civilian life proved more difficult than he had imagined. While many veterans struggled to reintegrate into society during this time, David's issues were compounded by his unresolved childhood traumas and emerging psychological disorders. He had learned discipline and how to use firearms, but he returned home still feeling lost, isolated, and increasingly angry. Back in New York, David tried to live a normal life. He worked a series of blue-collar jobs, including at the U.S. Postal Service, but he found little satisfaction. His co-workers described him as odd but generally harmless, a quiet man who kept to himself. Yet internally, he was unraveling. The structure of the Army was gone, replaced once again by the chaos of his own mind. Depression and paranoia began to creep in, and his old obsessions resurfaced. He once again turned to setting fires, continuing his secret campaign of arson across the city. Investigators would later estimate he was responsible for starting over 400 fires, a staggering number that hinted at the scale of his compulsion. His difficulties with women deepened as well. He longed for companionship, but was rejected repeatedly, fueling his bitterness. He began to view women as the source of his pain, tying his feelings of abandonment from his biological mother to every failed interaction he experienced. This connection between personal rejection and rage toward women became a defining psychological pattern in his life. As the mid-1970s unfolded, David's mental state grew darker. He began to experience delusions, claiming later that he believed demons were communicating with him. At times, he thought animals, especially dogs, were sending him messages. He would later famously say that his neighbor's black Labrador, supposedly possessed by a demon, commanded him to kill. Whether this was a genuine delusion or a fabricated excuse, his descent into a world of paranoia and fantasy was becoming dangerous. By 1975, David had fully returned to the Bronx, living alone in an apartment. Neighbors described him as strange and solitary, with little interaction except for occasional odd behavior. Some recalled hearing him argue with himself or mutter late at night. Others noticed his obsession with dogs, sometimes friendly, other times hostile. The man who once sought discipline in the army was now adrift in a city that seemed indifferent to his struggles. The transition from troubled youth to disturbed adult was nearly complete. He had endured a childhood marked by loss, isolation, and rejection. He had served his country, but found no peace in military life. Instead, he returned with skills that would later serve his violent impulses. His fantasies of destruction were no longer confined to fire. They were evolving, shifting toward something far more lethal. David Berkowitz was preparing, consciously or subconsciously, for the next chapter of his life. The fires of his youth were about to be replaced by bullets, and the lonely, angry young man was on the verge of transforming into the Son of Sam, the gunman who would terrorize New York City and cement his place in criminal history. When David Berkowitz returned from his service in the United States Army in 1974, many believed he was simply another young veteran adjusting to civilian life. But beneath the surface, David was unraveling. The rigid structure of the military, which had held his restless mind in check, was gone. In its place was the aimlessness of daily life, and that void quickly became fertile ground for his darker impulses. He took jobs here and there, eventually landing steady employment as a letter sorter for the U.S. Postal Service, but work offered no real satisfaction. His colleagues saw him as a loner, quiet, but sometimes prone to sudden flashes of irritation. He wasn't violent in the workplace, but he was noticeably disconnected, existing on the fringes of social interactions. After hours, he often withdrew into solitude, wandering city streets or isolating himself in his apartment. It was during this time that David returned to his old obsession, fire. Long before the shootings that would make him infamous, Berkowitz had built a private world of destruction through arson. Investigators would later connect him to an astonishing number of fires, more than 400 incidents scattered across New York City in the mid-1970s. Each fire was carefully set, often in abandoned buildings, vacant lots, or garbage bins. To most, they appeared to be the random acts of a faceless vandal, but to David they were something much more personal. In his mind, fire gave him power. It was a ritual of control. Watching flames consume wood, metal, or garbage filled him with a twisted sense of satisfaction. He began keeping detailed notebooks cataloging each fire he started, documenting dates, times, and locations like a scientist tracking experiments. For him, arson wasn't just destruction. It was evidence of his ability to command chaos in a world where he felt powerless. But fire was only one expression of his mental decline. Berkowitz was also sinking into paranoia and delusion. His childhood loneliness, his strained relationships, and his discovery of being adopted had already shaped his worldview into one of rejection and resentment. Now, he began to interpret ordinary life through a lens of conspiracy and supernatural influence. He claimed to hear voices. He believed demons were communicating with him, sometimes through animals, sometimes through his environment. The most infamous of these delusions involved dogs. In his Yonkers neighborhood, David became obsessed with a black Labrador retriever owned by his neighbor, Sam Carr. He would later claim that this dog was possessed by a demon, and that its barking carried commands for him to kill. Whether this was a genuine psychotic delusion or an excuse fabricated after his arrest remains debated. But what is clear is that during this period, David's mental state deteriorated into a dangerous mix of paranoia, resentment, and violent fantasy. Neighbors began noticing his strange behavior. He kept odd hours, often roaming late at night. He seemed tense, muttering under his breath, and sometimes glared at people for no reason. On some occasions, he lashed out in anger. In one disturbing incident, he shot a neighbor's dog with a rifle, convinced the animal was part of the demonic conspiracy against him. These behaviors painted a picture of a man increasingly disconnected from reality. While his paranoia grew, so too did his fixation on women. David's difficulties with relationships and rejection by women weighed heavily on his mind. He saw women as both desirable and threatening. They reminded him of the mother who had abandoned him, of the girls who had rejected him, and of the companions he could never secure. In his mind, they became symbols of everything he hated about himself and the world. This resentment simmered until it turned into rage. By 1975, David's descent into arson and mental instability had escalated to a dangerous threshold. The fires were no longer enough. The thrill of destruction through flames began to fade, replaced by a growing urge for direct confrontation with life and death. He wanted not just to watch destruction, but to create it in the most personal way possible, by taking human lives. This transition did not happen overnight. It began with fantasies. David admitted later that he would walk the streets imagining himself attacking strangers, envisioning scenarios where he held power over life itself. These violent thoughts grew more detailed and more insistent as time passed. His journals, once filled with notes about fires, began to reflect his darker ambitions. Psychologists later pointed out that David's behavior during this time fit a classic pattern of escalation in criminal pathology. Many serial offenders begin with less personal crimes, such as arson or animal cruelty, before moving toward acts of violence against people. Fire had given David control over objects and structures, but it had not satisfied his deeper desire for dominance. Killing, he believed, would complete the cycle. Adding to this toxic mix was his increasing obsession with mystical and satanic ideas. The 1970s were a time when fringe religious movements, cults, and occult practices were seeping into public awareness. David became fascinated by these themes, interpreting his delusions through the language of demons, possession, and destiny. He began to believe that forces beyond his control were guiding him toward a mission of destruction. He saw himself not merely as a man, but as an instrument of evil. As these thoughts grew louder in his mind, his behavior became more erratic. Neighbors heard him pacing in his apartment late at night, sometimes yelling to himself as if in argument. He kept his curtains drawn, his lights dim, and his world increasingly isolated. The man who had once been a boy with troubled dreams was now an adult on the edge of violence. By the time 1976 arrived, David Berkowitz was standing at a crossroads of madness and murder. The fires he had set across New York had been practice runs, preludes to something far more devastating. He had trained in the army, he had mastered firearms, and now he was ready to turn his private fantasies into a public nightmare. The stage was set for the emergence of the Son of Sam. Within months, the city of New York would be plunged into fear, and the world would come to know the name David Berkowitz, not as the lonely boy from the Bronx, but as the gunman who claimed demons told him to kill. The year was 1976, and New York City was already a place of tension and fear. Crime rates were climbing, neighborhoods were deteriorating, and a financial crisis had plunged the city into near bankruptcy. Against this backdrop of urban decay, David Berkowitz, his mind consumed by paranoia, resentment, and violent fantasies, took the final step from arsonist to murderer. It began in the quiet Bronx neighborhood of Pelham Bay on the night of July 29, 1976. Two young women, Donna Loria, 18, and her friend Jody Valenti, 19, were sitting in Valenti's parked car outside Loria's home after a night out. They were laughing, chatting, doing what ordinary teenagers do. But in the shadows lurked Berkowitz, carrying the .44 caliber bulldog revolver, the weapon that would become synonymous with his reign of terror. Without warning, Berkowitz approached the car, pulled out the revolver, and fired. A single bullet struck Donna Lauria in the chest, killing her instantly. Jody Valenti was wounded but survived. The suddenness of the attack was shocking. No robbery, no words exchanged. Just cold-blooded violence. The city barely noticed at first. It was one of many violent crimes in a city already drowning in bloodshed. But for David Berkowitz, it was a turning point. He had crossed a line he could never retreat from. Over the next months, his attacks continued with chilling precision. On October 23, 1976, two more victims, Carl DeNaro and Rosemary Keenan, were shot while sitting in a parked car in Queens. Both survived, though DeNaro suffered serious injuries. Again, the motive seemed non-existent, the violence random. Police struggled to connect the dots, not yet realizing a serial gunman was stalking the streets. On November 27, 1976, David struck again. Donna DeMasi and Joanne Lomino, two teenage girls, were walking home in Queens when a stranger approached them. Without hesitation, he fired, wounding both. Joanne Lomino was left permanently paralyzed. For the city, the crime was another entry in the growing list of senseless attacks. For Berkowitz, it was another step deeper into his self-appointed role as an agent of chaos. The attacks had a pattern, though it wasn't immediately clear. Most of his targets were young women with long, dark hair, often attacked while sitting in cars or walking late at night. The randomness of his violence created an atmosphere of dread. It seemed that anyone, anywhere, could become his next victim. As 1977 began, Berkowitz's assaults grew more brazen. On January 30, 1977, he struck again in Queens, shooting Christine Fround and her fiancé John Dale as they sat in a parked car. Christine Fround was killed instantly. The randomness of the shootings, coupled with the choice of young couples, began to catch the attention of law enforcement. The NYPD realized they might be dealing with a serial shooter. Then, on March 8, 1977, Berkowitz attacked again. This time his victims were college student Virginia Voskorichin as she walked home from class in Queens. She was shot in the head and killed instantly. Now, the pattern was undeniable. The city was dealing with a single gunman and his weapon of choice. The .44 caliber Bulldog revolver became the infamous signature that linked the murders. By now, whispers of a serial killer were spreading through New York. Newspapers began reporting on the possibility of a single shooter targeting women across the city. Residents grew fearful. Women began changing their appearance, cutting or dyeing their hair to avoid resembling the victims. Couples hesitated to sit in parked cars late at night. A city already on edge was sliding into panic. The NYPD formed a special task force to investigate the shootings. Detectives pored over ballistics reports, interviewed survivors, and tried desperately to piece together the killer's identity. But Berkowitz was elusive. He had no direct connection to his victims, no clear motive, and no consistent pattern beyond his choice of weapon and general victim type. His ability to blend into the city's chaos made him nearly invisible. Meanwhile, Berkowitz himself was intoxicated by the attention, even though he hadn't yet revealed his identity to the press. He felt powerful, as if he held the city hostage through fear. Each attack reinforced his delusion that he was chosen, guided by demonic forces to carry out a mission of death. In his mind, he was no longer David Berkowitz, the lonely adopted boy from the Bronx. He was becoming something larger, a hunter, a messenger of evil. The killings were terrifying not just for their violence, but for their unpredictability. They occurred in different boroughs: Bronx, Queens, Brooklyn, making it difficult for police to establish patterns of movement. Victims had no personal ties to him, which eliminated the usual investigative leads. The randomness became his greatest weapon. It made him untouchable, at least for the time being. By spring of 1977, the case had captured the full attention of the press. Headlines warned of a mysterious gunman stalking young women. Survivors described fleeting glimpses of a man with a stocky build and dark hair. But their accounts varied and left police with little concrete information. The sense of panic grew as each attack seemed to come closer together, as if the killer was accelerating his pace. In truth, that was exactly what was happening. Berkowitz, emboldened by his survival and the lack of progress by police, was preparing to taunt the city in a way few criminals ever had. The killings alone had shaken New York. But what would come next? The infamous letters signed, Son of Sam, would transform the case from a local crime wave into one of the most notorious serial killer hunts in American history. But even before those letters arrived, the fear was real. Parents warned their daughters not to go out at night. Couples thought twice before parking in secluded areas. Entire neighborhoods whispered about the mysterious gunman who struck without warning. David Berkowitz, sitting alone in his Yonkers apartment, feeding his delusions of demonic voices and destiny, was about to become the most feared man in New York. The first wave of attacks had done their work. They had introduced the city to the random cruelty of the Son of Sam. But the true reign of terror had only just begun. By the spring of 1977, New York City was a city under siege. A mysterious gunman armed with the .44 caliber Bulldog revolver had left a trail of dead and wounded across the Bronx, Queens, and Brooklyn. His victims were mostly young women, often brunettes, attacked while sitting in parked cars or walking late at night. The randomness of the violence created paralyzing fear, but the killer was not content with the terror his bullets alone produced. He wanted to be known, feared, and remembered. This desire for recognition led David Berkowitz to take a step that would immortalize his crimes. He began writing letters. These were not ordinary communications. They were taunts, threats, and bizarre proclamations steeped in delusion and theatricality. With them, he gave himself a name, a persona that would dominate headlines: Son of Sam. The first of these infamous letters appeared after the murder of Christine Friend and the killing of Virginia Voskerichian. Detectives already suspected a serial shooter, but in April 1977, they found the first written clue directly from the killer. It was discovered near the body of two more victims, Alexander Asau and Valentina Suriani, shot in the Bronx on April 17, 1977. The letter, scrawled with unsettling phrases, was addressed directly to NYPD Captain Joseph Borelli, one of the lead investigators. In it, the killer mocked the police, calling himself Son of Sam. He claimed he was commanded by his father, Sam, to kill. He described himself as a monster who could not stop his urge for blood. His writing style was strange, childlike, misspelled, but dripping with menace. One passage read, "I am deeply hurt by your calling me a woman hater. I am not, but I am a monster. I am the Son of Sam." The use of that name transformed the investigation. Until then, the press had referred to the shooter as the .44 caliber killer. Now, the killer had branded himself. The name, Son of Sam, spread instantly across newspapers and television broadcasts. It was sensational, mysterious, and terrifying, a pseudonym that made the gunman feel more like an urban legend than an ordinary criminal. But Berkowitz was not done. He craved attention, and with each killing, His confidence grew. He decided to communicate directly with the media. His most notorious letter arrived at the offices of the New York Daily News in May 1977, addressed to columnist Jimmy Breslin, one of the city's most famous writers. The letter was long, rambling, and laced with cryptic messages. In it, Berkowitz once again referred to himself as Son of Sam, mocked police efforts, and described his compulsion to kill. What struck readers most was the taunting tone, playful in parts, threatening in others. He signed it with a chilling flourish, a strange logo featuring Gothic handwriting and references to demons. Breslin and the Daily News made the controversial decision to publish the letter, albeit with some edits, on the front page. The result was explosive. New Yorkers devoured every word. The city, already living in fear, now had a voice to attach to the violence. The Son of Sam was no longer just a faceless shooter. He was a figure speaking directly to the public, toying with their fear. The reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Phone lines at police headquarters were flooded with tips, many useless, some bizarre. Self-proclaimed psychics claimed to have visions of the killer. Neighbors turned in neighbors. Paranoia spread. The NYPD, under immense pressure, dedicated more officers to the case than any manhunt in the city's history. Berkowitz, meanwhile, reveled in the chaos. For him, the media attention validated his delusions. He believed himself to be more than a man. He was a messenger of dark forces, a chosen killer destined for infamy. The letters fed his ego, and the newspaper coverage gave him the audience he craved. The language of the letters also revealed much about his disturbed psyche. He spoke of his Father Sam, often believed to be a reference to his neighbor Sam Carr, the man whose dog Berkowitz later claimed was possessed by demons commanding him to kill. The letter's bizarre mix of taunts, threats, and occult references suggested a mind caught between delusion and manipulation. For police, the letters were both a blessing and a curse. On one hand, they confirmed that the shootings were the work of a single killer and provided a nickname that galvanized public awareness. On the other, they amplified fear to a fever pitch. Every woman with dark hair feared becoming a target. Couples avoided quiet streets. Nightlife in New York dimmed as people stayed indoors, afraid of crossing paths with the Son of Sam. The city, which had already been battling crime waves, economic collapse, and widespread distrust in authority, now faced an invisible predator who seemed to mock their helplessness. The Son of Sam was not just killing people. He was killing the city's sense of safety. By June and July of 1977, his reputation was at its peak. The Son of Sam was the subject of daily headlines, radio talk shows, and late-night conversations across the city. Everyone speculated who was he. Where would he strike next? Was he truly insane or a calculated monster? The fear was no longer just in the boroughs where he attacked. It had spread citywide, a cloud of anxiety that hung over millions of residents. Through it all, Berkowitz continued to feed on the fear he created. Alone in his Yonkers apartment, he clipped newspaper articles about himself, reading them with satisfaction. The world finally knew his name, or at least the name he had chosen. He had taken the leap from anonymous shooter to infamous killer. The letters had accomplished what the bullets alone could not. They turned David Berkowitz into a legend of fear. And as summer deepened in New York, the Summer of Sam, as it would later be called, was about to reach its deadly climax. By the summer of 1977, the Son of Sam killings had become more than a crime spree. They were a citywide nightmare. New Yorkers woke each morning to headlines announcing another shooting, another letter, another night of fear. The killer was no longer just a faceless man with a gun. He was a presence that haunted the streets, a predator who could strike anyone, anywhere, without warning. The attacks continued with chilling regularity. On April 17, 1977, just before his letter to Captain Joseph Borelli was found, Berkowitz had killed Valentina Suriani and her boyfriend Alexander Esau in the Bronx. It was this attack that first introduced his name, Son of Sam, into the investigation. That same letter made its way into the public sphere, and from then on, every shooting carried with it the shadow of his chosen identity. Only weeks later, on June 26, 1977, the killer struck again. His victims this time were Sal Lupo and Judy Placido, both in their 20s, sitting in a car after leaving a nightclub in Queens. The pattern was the same: young couples, dark hair, parked cars. Though both survived the attack, they were gravely injured. Their testimonies added more fragments to the police's growing, but still incomplete profile of the gunman. By this time, fear was transforming daily life in New York City. Women who matched the profile of the victims, especially those with long, dark hair, began taking drastic steps to alter their appearance. Hair salons saw an unprecedented surge in customers cutting their hair short or dyeing it blonde. It was a desperate attempt to avoid becoming the next target of the Son of Sam. Nightlife suffered as well. Clubs, bars, and late-night restaurants reported declining attendance. Couples who once sought the privacy of parked cars now thought twice, fearing that what should have been a romantic moment could turn into a deadly ambush. Parents kept closer watch over their daughters, urging them not to go out at night. The very fabric of the city's social life was being reshaped by fear. The NYPD, under enormous pressure, had created a special task force known as the Operation Omega Unit, consisting of hundreds of officers dedicated solely to the case. Detectives sifted through mountains of evidence, interviewed survivors, and followed thousands of leads. But Berkowitz remained one step ahead. His attacks were spread across different boroughs, his choice of victims random enough to prevent easy prediction, and his ability to vanish into the city's shadows left investigators chasing ghosts. Meanwhile, the press amplified the hysteria. Every new attack made the front page. Every cryptic detail from his letters was dissected by columnists, radio hosts, and television anchors. The Son of Sam had become not just a criminal, but a cultural phenomenon, a symbol of the city's vulnerability. The killer himself fed on this attention, clipping articles and reveling in his newfound infamy. Then came the night of July 31st, 1977, the attack that would prove to be his last, but also one of his most infamous. On that humid summer night in Brooklyn, Stacy Moskowitz, 20, and her date, Robert Violante, were sitting in a car after leaving a movie. They were young, carefree, and unaware that their evening would place them in the crosshairs of New York's most feared man. Berkowitz approached quietly, revolver in hand, and opened fire. Stacy Moskowitz was fatally wounded, dying hours later in the hospital. Robert Violante survived, but was left permanently blind in one eye. It was the only attack that took place in Brooklyn, but it shook the entire city to its core. The Son of Sam had struck again, and despite the massive police presence, he was still free. The Moskowitz killing was different in another way. It produced crucial evidence. Witnesses in the area recalled seeing a suspicious man near a yellow Volkswagen Beetle parked nearby. Others noticed a man acting strangely, discarding a ticket near a fire hydrant. These seemingly small details would eventually crack the case wide open. But at that moment, all the city felt was grief, rage, and fear. The Summer of Sam, as the press would soon call it, had reached its peak. For over a year, from July 1976 to July 1977, Berkowitz had held New York hostage with his gun and his words. He killed 6 people and wounded 7 others. But the impact of his crimes went far beyond numbers. He had changed the way people lived, altering routines, breaking down the sense of security that even in crime-ridden New York had seemed untouchable. Beyond the immediate fear, Berkowitz's crimes also reflected a larger cultural anxiety. The mid-1970s were already a dark time for the city. Financial collapse had nearly bankrupted New York in 1975. Crime was rampant, with muggings, robberies, and murders filling the headlines. Blackouts, strikes, and political scandals added to the sense of decline. The Son of Sam became the ultimate symbol of this decay, a lone gunman who could paralyze millions with a handful of bullets and a few handwritten letters. The police, under pressure like never before, intensified their manhunt. Roadblocks were set up, surveillance increased, and plainclothes officers patrolled night after night. But for the average New Yorker, none of it seemed to matter. The killer was still out there, and he seemed unstoppable. What terrified people most was his unpredictability. Unlike traditional criminals, Berkowitz did not kill for money, revenge, or even passion. His motives, cloaked in talk of demons and commands from Sam, were incomprehensible. He represented pure, senseless violence. That unpredictability magnified the terror, because if the killer had no reason, then anyone could be next. By the end of July 1977, the city was desperate for answers. The Son of Sam had become the most hunted man in America. The NYPD's task force had swelled to over 300 officers, making it the largest manhunt in New York's history. Yet even with the full force of law enforcement against him, Berkowitz felt invincible. He believed his mission was guided by supernatural forces, and the chaos he sowed only confirmed his sense of purpose. But cracks were beginning to form. Witnesses had noticed things. Patterns were starting to emerge, and Berkowitz, intoxicated by his own notoriety, was growing careless. The same desire for recognition that led him to write letters would ultimately lead to his downfall. The Son of Sam's reign of terror had reached its height. The city trembled under his shadow. But soon, very soon, the hunter would become the hunted. The summer of 1977 had been one of the darkest in New York City's history. 6 lives had been lost, 7 others gravely wounded, and millions terrorized by a man who called himself the Son of Sam. The killings had stretched across boroughs and defied police predictions. Despite the largest manhunt the city had ever seen, the killer remained at large, until a series of seemingly small details cracked the case wide open. The final shooting on July 31, 1977, in Brooklyn left Stacy Moskowitz dead and Robert Violante permanently blinded in one eye. It also left behind crucial evidence that would prove Berkowitz's undoing. Witnesses reported a suspicious man walking near a parked yellow Volkswagen Beetle close to the scene. Others recalled seeing the same car ticketed for being too close to a fire hydrant that night. These fragments of observation, insignificant at first glance, would soon converge to reveal the face of the Son of Sam. The investigation had already reached fever pitch. The NYPD's Operation Omega Task Force had grown to more than 300 officers, working around the clock, chasing thousands of tips and compiling mountains of reports. Yet until that August, their suspect list was a blur of false leads. They were drowning in information but starving for a breakthrough. That breakthrough came from a simple parking ticket. Detective James Justice of Yonkers received word that a car registered to a man named David Berkowitz had been ticketed on the very night and at the very location of the Moskowitz shooting. The Volkswagen Beetle had been issued a summons for being illegally parked near a fire hydrant only blocks away from the murder scene. It was the kind of detail that, in any other case, might have been dismissed. But here, it was a thread worth pulling. When detectives began to look deeper into Berkowitz, the pieces began to fall into place. He was a 24-year-old postal worker living in Yonkers, just north of the Bronx. His neighbors described him as odd, reclusive, and prone to strange behavior. Rumors swirled about his obsession with barking dogs, his mutterings about demons, and his peculiar nighttime activities. The more investigators dug, the more their suspicions grew. By early August, detectives began discreet surveillance of Berkowitz's apartment at 35 Pine Street in Yonkers. They watched him come and go, noting his routines. When they obtained a warrant to search his car, the results confirmed their worst fears. Inside the yellow Volkswagen Beetle, officers found a duffel bag containing maps of past crime scenes, a rifle, and ammunition. Even more damning, they discovered a letter addressed to police. Another mocking note written in the same style as the previous Son of Sam letters. At that point, detectives knew they had their man. Yet they proceeded with caution. On the night of August 10, 1977, a team of plainclothes officers positioned themselves around Berkowitz's apartment. Shortly before midnight, Berkowitz exited his building, carrying nothing but his car keys. As he approached his Volkswagen, officers moved in and surrounded him. When detectives opened the driver's door, they found the .44 caliber Bulldog revolver, the very weapon that had terrorized New York for over a year, sitting on the passenger seat. It was as if Berkowitz had been waiting for them. Detective John Filatico, leading the arrest, pointed his gun at Berkowitz and told him not to move. In response, Berkowitz smiled faintly and said words that would become infamous. "Well, you got me." "How come it took you so long?" "There was no struggle, no attempt to escape." The man who had eluded police for months surrendered calmly, almost with relief. Back at the precinct, Berkowitz began to speak freely. He confessed to being the son of Sam, admitting to the shootings in a tone that was disturbingly casual. He explained that he had been commanded to kill by a demon that spoke to him through his neighbor's black Labrador retriever, a dog he claimed was possessed. He said Sam referred to Sam Carr, his neighbor whose dog delivered messages from the demonic world. The explanation was bizarre, even absurd, but Berkowitz seemed utterly convinced of it. Detectives were stunned. Some believed he was mentally ill. Others thought he was fabricating a story to appear insane. But one thing was certain: the long reign of terror was finally over. When news of his capture spread the next morning, New York City erupted in relief. Headlines across every paper announced the same words: "Son of Sam caught." For the first time in over a year, the city could breathe. Strangers on the street hugged one another. Families celebrated. Police officers, exhausted from endless nights chasing leads, finally had their victory. The arrest also revealed the odd duality of Berkowitz's life. To his co-workers at the Postal Service, he was quiet but reliable. To neighbors, he was strange but not outwardly violent. Yet inside his apartment, police found a disturbing collection of writings. Diaries filled with accounts of hundreds of arsons he had set, references to demons, and ramblings about his father Sam. His world was one of paranoia and fantasy, hidden behind the facade of an ordinary man. The capture marked the end of the son of Sam's reign, but the beginning of another chapter: his trial, his sentencing, and the long years he would spend behind bars. Yet for New Yorkers, the arrest was more than the end of a case. It was the restoration of normalcy. The summer of 1977 would forever be remembered as the Summer of Sam. It was a time when the city had been held hostage by one man's madness, when fear had dictated fashion, nightlife, and daily routines. And now, with the son of Sam in custody, New Yorkers hoped that chapter was closed for good. But even as Berkowitz sat in a jail cell, questions lingered. Was he truly insane? Or was the talk of demons a calculated attempt to avoid the harshest punishment? Had he acted alone, or were there others involved? As some conspiracy theories would later suggest, and most chilling of all, if one man could terrify a city of millions, could it happen again? For now, though relief outweighed fear, the long hunt was over. The son of Sam had been caught. The arrest of David Berkowitz in August 1977 ended one of the most terrifying manhunts in American history. But for New Yorkers, the capture of the son of Sam was not the final chapter. The next stage was the judicial process, one that would test the boundaries between justice, mental illness, and punishment. From the moment he was taken into custody, Berkowitz fascinated and disturbed both investigators and the public. His calm confession, his bizarre explanation about demonic voices, and his unshaken composure painted the portrait of a man at odds with reality. Police searched his Yonkers apartment and found a chaotic collection of writings, diaries detailing hundreds of arsons, ramblings about Satan, and strange notes suggesting a world of paranoia and delusion. Almost immediately, the question arose, was Berkowitz insane? His claims were outlandish. He insisted that a demon had spoken to him through the barking of his neighbor's black Labrador retriever. He said the demon, acting as a messenger for Sam, ordered him to kill. To many, this sounded like the ravings of a mentally ill man. To others, it was a calculated performance designed to shield him from the full weight of justice. Psychiatrists were brought in to examine him. Some believed he was schizophrenic, plagued by paranoid delusions. Others concluded that, despite his bizarre beliefs, he understood the nature of his actions and the consequences of his crimes. That distinction between genuine insanity and manipulative madness would become central to the case. In the court of public opinion, however, Berkowitz was already guilty. The city, still raw from the terror of the Summer of Sam, wanted swift justice. Survivors of his attacks, along with the families of the 6 people he murdered, demanded accountability. For them, his stories about demons and dogs were irrelevant. He had pulled the trigger. He had destroyed lives. The legal proceedings began in early 1978. Prosecutors prepared to charge Berkowitz with multiple counts of murder and attempted murder. The evidence was overwhelming. Ballistic tests linked his .44 caliber revolver to the shootings. Eyewitnesses placed him near crime scenes, and his own confessions sealed the case. The letters he had written to police and the press further reinforced his identity as the son of Sam. At first, Berkowitz's defense team considered an insanity plea. They argued that his claims about demonic possession showed he was not in control of his actions. But as psychiatrists weighed in, the consensus shifted. The majority of experts concluded that Berkowitz, while disturbed, was competent to stand trial. He knew right from wrong. He understood the criminality of his actions. Then came the unexpected twist. Berkowitz chose to plead guilty. In May 1978, he stood before a judge and admitted to the shootings. He described his crimes in chilling detail, showing little emotion as he recounted the moments of terror he inflicted. For the families of his victims, it was a painful but necessary moment, an acknowledgement of guilt that removed the possibility of a lengthy trial. But even in his plea hearings, Berkowitz could not resist theatrics. During one session, he shouted, "Stacy was a war," referring cruelly to his final victim, Stacy Moskowitz. The courtroom erupted in outrage, and guards restrained him as he ranted about demons and dark forces. The outburst reinforced the perception that Berkowitz was both disturbed and manipulative, a man who thrived on the attention his crimes had given him. On June 12, 1978, Berkowitz was formally sentenced. He received 25 years to life for each of the 6 murders, with the sentences to be served consecutively. In practice, this meant he would never leave prison. The judge's words were firm. Society had no place for the son of Sam outside the walls of a maximum security facility. After sentencing, Berkowitz was transferred to Attica Correctional Facility, one of New York's most notorious prisons. The same prison had been the site of a bloody uprising just a few years earlier, in 1971. For Berkowitz, Attica would become the stark reality of his new life: cold cells, constant supervision, and the loss of the freedom he had abused so horrifically. Yet even behind bars, Berkowitz's presence lingered in the public eye. Newspapers continued to cover his every move. His letters from prison were scrutinized, and his behavior was monitored for signs of remorse or further madness. For many, it seemed the son of Sam still craved attention even as an inmate. The trial and sentencing closed the door on the Summer of Sam era, but the wounds remained. Families continued to grieve. Survivors lived with permanent injuries and trauma, and the city, though relieved, was left to grapple with the deeper questions his crimes had raised. How could one man terrorize millions? Could this happen again? Was justice truly enough to heal the scars? In the end, Berkowitz's guilty plea and life sentences provided closure, if not peace. He was locked away, his gun silenced, his letters reduced to prison mail. The son of Sam was no longer free to prowl the streets of New York, but his shadow lingered in headlines, in nightmares, and in the collective memory of a city that would never forget the summer when fear ruled the night. The sentencing of David Berkowitz in June 1978 may have closed the courtroom chapter of his story, but it did not end his presence in the public consciousness. For many, the son of Sam was not simply a criminal to be locked away. He was a symbol of fear, madness, and the fragility of urban life. And even behind the walls of prison, Berkowitz continued to command a troubling fascination. His early years in confinement were marked by instability and violence. At Attica Correctional Facility, he became a target for other inmates, many of whom sought notoriety by attacking the infamous serial killer. In 1979, only a year after his sentencing, Berkowitz was slashed across the throat in an assault that nearly cost him his life. The wound required dozens of stitches and left him with a scar that he would carry permanently. Though shaken by the attack, Berkowitz survived, and over time he adapted to prison life. He was later transferred to other facilities, including Sullivan Correctional Facility in Fallsburg, New York, where he would spend much of his later years. The structure and routine of incarceration seemed to calm him, and gradually the wild-eyed killer who once boasted of demons gave way to a quieter, more subdued man. But Berkowitz's story in prison took an unexpected turn in the mid-1980s. In 1987, he claimed to have experienced a profound religious conversion after reading a Bible given to him by a fellow inmate. He declared himself a born-again Christian, renouncing his past and insisting that he was no longer the son of Sam, but instead a child of God. From that point onward, Berkowitz styled himself as an evangelist within the prison system. He began studying scripture, leading Bible studies, and counseling other inmates. He wrote essays and letters urging young people to avoid the path he had taken, warning them about the dangers of violence, sin, and spiritual emptiness. He even adopted a new identity for himself, the Son of Hope. To Berkowitz, this name symbolized his rejection of the darkness that had once defined him and his embrace of faith. Through prison ministries, his testimony was published online and in religious newsletters, spreading his words far beyond the prison walls. To some, this transformation appeared genuine. Religious volunteers and chaplains who worked with Berkowitz often described him as humble, soft-spoken, and sincere in his devotion. They pointed to his decades-long commitment to faith as evidence that his conversion was not a ploy for sympathy, but a true change of heart. Yet to many others, skepticism remained. The wounds inflicted by the son of Sam were too deep, his crimes too horrifying, for forgiveness to feel possible. Survivors of his attacks, along with the families of his victims, often rejected his claims of redemption, arguing that no amount of prayer or repentance could undo the suffering he had caused. For them, Berkowitz's conversion was nothing more than a convenient narrative, one that allowed him to recast himself in a softer light while still enjoying notoriety. The state of New York agreed with them in one important regard, regardless of his religious awakening. Berkowitz would never walk free. Time and again, he declined to seek parole, stating publicly that he believed he belonged in prison for the rest of his life. On the rare occasions when parole hearings were scheduled automatically, he either waived his right to attend or told the board he did not deserve release. But even if Berkowitz renounced his freedom, he never disappeared from public attention. Journalists, authors, and documentary filmmakers continued to revisit his story, ensuring that his name remained etched into American crime lore. The Son of Sam law, legislation originally passed in New York to prevent criminals from profiting off the publicity of their crimes, was a direct result of his case. Though later challenged in court, the law itself reflected society's struggle to contain his shadow. In interviews conducted from prison, Berkowitz often expressed remorse. He spoke about the weight of guilt he carried and his prayers for the victims' families. He claimed to no longer hear demonic voices, framing his earlier delusions as products of mental illness and spiritual emptiness. And yet, there remained an unsettling contradiction. Even as he denounced his former self, his very existence as David Berkowitz continued to fascinate and horrify the outside world. His writings from prison, which included personal testimonies and religious reflections, were widely circulated online in the 2000s. Supporters praised his words as evidence of transformation, while critics saw them as yet another way for the Son of Sam to reach an audience, something he had always craved. The debate over Berkowitz's sincerity illustrates a larger truth about his legacy. He was not merely a man who committed crimes. He became a figure onto which society projected its fears, anger, and doubts about human nature. Could someone capable of such senseless violence truly change? Could he ever be forgiven? Or was his faith just another mask, another performance in a life built on manipulation? What cannot be denied is that Berkowitz has spent nearly 5 decades in prison, long after the summer when his name first struck terror into the hearts of New Yorkers. He has lived more of his life behind bars than in the free world. Today he is an aging man, no longer the shadowy figure lurking with the .44 revolver, but a prisoner in his 70s, confined to the slow passage of time. Yet even now, the fascination endures. Every anniversary of his arrest brings renewed attention. Every documentary or book revisits the same chilling story. And every time Berkowitz's name appears in the news, the same questions resurface. Who was he really? A monster beyond redemption, or a broken man who found faith too late? For the victims and their families, the answer is clear. Berkowitz may call himself the Son of Hope, but to them, he will always remain the Son of Sam, the man who turned a city into a battlefield of fear, whose crimes cannot be undone by words, prayers, or faith. The story of David Berkowitz, the Son of Sam, does not end with his capture, conviction, or even his decades in prison. His legacy has seeped into the fabric of American culture, becoming a dark reminder of how a single man's violence can change a city, influence laws, and alter public consciousness for generations. The immediate legacy of Berkowitz's crimes was one of trauma. Between 1976 and 1977, 6 people lost their lives and 7 others were permanently scarred by his attacks. Families were shattered, friendships broken, and survivors left to navigate lives marked by physical pain and psychological scars. The grief of those closest to his victims remains an indelible part of his story. For them, no amount of time, no courtroom verdict, and no prison sentence can undo what was taken. Yet beyond the personal tragedies, Berkowitz's actions cast a longer shadow over New York City itself. The Summer of Sam became shorthand for an era when fear ruled the streets. At a time when New York was already reeling from financial collapse, rising crime, and crumbling public trust, the son of Sam embodied the sense of decay and chaos. His reign of terror reinforced the image of the city as dangerous, unpredictable, and on the brink of collapse. The media's role in amplifying his crimes is also central to his legacy. Berkowitz was one of the first modern killers to fully grasp the power of attention. His letters to the press transformed him from an anonymous shooter into a household name. Newspapers, desperate for headlines, gave him front-page coverage, feeding into the very notoriety he craved. This symbiotic relationship between killer and media set a precedent for future cases, raising difficult ethical questions about how much attention should be given to criminals who seek the spotlight. The cultural impact extended beyond journalism. The Son of Sam case inspired books, films, and television shows. Spike Lee's 1999 film Summer of Sam depicted the paranoia and hysteria that gripped New York during those months. Countless documentaries and crime series have revisited the case, analyzing Berkowitz's psychology, the failures and triumphs of the police investigation, and the enduring fascination with his story. In this way, Berkowitz became not just a criminal, but a figure of cultural mythology, his name synonymous with senseless violence and urban terror. Another part of his legacy lies in the legal realm. In direct response to the publicity surrounding his crimes, New York passed the Son of Sam Law in 1977. This law was designed to prevent criminals from profiting off their notoriety by selling their stories to publishers, filmmakers, or other media outlets. Any money earned from such deals would instead be redirected to the victims or their families. Though later challenged and revised, the law highlighted society's struggle to balance free speech with justice and fairness for victims. It was one of the most tangible legal consequences of Berkowitz's actions, showing how his crimes reshaped the very framework of American criminal law. But perhaps the most unsettling part of Berkowitz's legacy is the enduring fascination with his persona. Decades after his arrest, people continue to study his life, his writings, and his supposed transformation in prison. Some view his religious conversion and son of hope, identity as genuine redemption. Others see it as a manipulative performance by a man who has always sought attention. This ongoing debate reflects broader questions about human nature, punishment, and forgiveness. Can a man who committed such atrocities ever truly change? And if he does, should society acknowledge it? Berkowitz's own reflections add to the complexity. Over the years, he has consistently stated that he does not want parole, claiming that he accepts his fate behind bars. He has written letters of apology, expressed remorse, and worked within prison ministries to guide others toward faith. Yet his words, however sincere, exist in tension with the reality of his crimes. For the families of his victims, no statement of regret can erase the violence he inflicted. The Son of Sam case also serves as a grim study in how loneliness, delusion, and untreated mental illness can fester into something catastrophic. Berkowitz's background, his troubled adoption, his isolation, his obsession with arson, and his eventual descent into violent delusion, offers insight into the warning signs that were missed or ignored. His story is not only one of evil, but also a failure of mental health systems, of community intervention, and of recognizing danger before it exploded into tragedy. In the end, Berkowitz's life is a paradox. He is a man defined by his worst actions, yet he has lived for decades beyond them, transforming in ways that defy simple labels. To some, he remains forever the son of Sam, the monster who prowled the night with the .44 revolver. To others, he is a cautionary tale of wasted life and the possibility of spiritual redemption. But for history, his legacy is clear. He changed the way America understood serial killers, crime reporting, and the relationship between violence and publicity. He showed how fear could spread like wildfire through a city, how one man's actions could alter the lives of millions, and how the echoes of terror can last far longer than the crimes themselves. As of today, David Berkowitz remains in prison, an old man serving out 6 consecutive life sentences. The world outside has changed dramatically since the summer of 1977. New York has reinvented itself many times over. But inside those prison walls, Berkowitz lives as a reminder of that violent season, a symbol of fear, fascination, and the enduring human struggle to make sense of senseless violence. His story forces us to confront difficult truths. That evil can wear the face of an ordinary man, that a city can be held hostage by paranoia, that justice, while necessary, cannot always heal the deepest wounds, and that some names, no matter how much time passes, become etched into history, not as warnings of what we must admire, but of what we must never allow ourselves to forget. The son of Sam is gone from the streets, but his legacy endures, a chilling reminder that sometimes the darkest shadows are cast by a single individual, armed not just with a weapon, but with a hunger to be remembered.